Good afternoon, Britain. It is 49 minutes past 1, and as we've been discussing, the UK has announced it will be handing sovereignty of a cluster of strategically important islands in the Indian Ocean over to Mauritius, ending years of stop-start negotiations.
Well, let's discuss this further now with the writer and commentator Benedict Spence. Benedict, this of course began under the last government, but when David Cameron became Foreign Secretary, he put a stop to it. He said, we're not going to negotiate handing over these islands. But this government seems to have restarted the process, but not just that, done it in record speed.
Yes, they've quite literally fast-tracked it, and they've done it at a time when Parliament isn't sitting and the Conservative Party is in the midst of its incredibly self-indulgent leadership contest, so that as little scrutiny can be placed on this as possible. Of course, this will come as a relief, I suppose, to one of the candidates, James Cleverly, who was responsible for restarting and overseeing part of this negotiation process. But this is, I think, a taste of what is going to come over the rest of the period in which Labour is going to be in power. And remember, this is, 92 days into this new government. We haven't even reached the 100-day mark yet. And they are already agreeing to give away strategically important bits of British territory to countries that didn't even exist when these places were first populated in the first place. For some context, the Chagos Islands have been inhabited even less time than the Falkland Islands have. Mauritius only got its independence as a state in 1962, and the Mauritian people were not, in fact, part of the indigenous or even the early settling group of people that were there. They tended to come from India, Malay, and, of course, from Europe. What this is all about, obviously, is a bit of a shakedown by Mauritius. The International Court of Justice issued an advisory decision saying that it felt that Britain didn't have a say to the island and that Mauritius did. You don't actually have to abide by an advisory statement. It is not binding. It is simply the opinion of the court. But the British government has decided to do this nonetheless. And what Mauritius now gets out of this is that the British government will pay Mauritius for the privilege of resettling these islands with whoever it is that they want to settle them with. And on top of that, as a little sort of addendum, we get to lease for money the military base at Diego Garcia for 99 years, which, of course, we're subcontracting out largely to the United States. So we're going to pay for this for less than a century, though, of course, given that Mauritius is not like the UK, and it is not one of these countries that necessarily follows the letter of the law, it is entirely within its rights to rip up that agreement if it would like. It's also entirely within its rights to give away any of the other 1,000 Chagos Islands to any other power that decides it would quite like to bid for them. And this, of course, is why these islands are so important and why it is that Mauritius gets so much money, specifically from China, in terms of international aid, because it wants a say in this. China does not actually even need to build a base in the Chagos Islands. All it needs is access to one in which it can then start installing radar stations, listening stations. And at that point, that base becomes functionally useless. At a crucial time for geopolitics, we have given away sovereignty of something to a country that never had any right over this thing, or some far-fetched idea of, I don't even know, post-colonialism, post-imperialism, repatriation. The Chagos Islanders themselves don't even want to be part of Mauritius.
Indeed.
They have not been saying this. It's a disgrace.
Benedict, this does seem to be part of a wider trend, particularly amongst left-wing politicians, to think that anything that the international community says is moral and ethical, but what British people want isn't. Where has that come from, and are there any other international judgments that we should be concerned about?
I mean, there are all sorts of international judgments that you should be concerned about. I suppose the main one was the advisory judgment that Israel might potentially be capable of committing genocide in Gaza, but hasn't actually, at which point half of the world said, here we are, this is evidence that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. This is a large part of the problem, is, of course, that people can decide if they want to wildly misinterpret judgments of international courts. But it's interesting what you point out there, that this now means that Britain's foreign policy, and indeed its domestic policy, can be influenced by the international community, whatever that is. It's very straightforward what that is. Let's take a list of all the countries in the world and list which ones of those you wouldn't want to live in. Those countries all now get a say in Britain's foreign policy and domestic policy, as long as they can influence international bodies like the United Nations to say one thing.
And we've seen the sort of Chinese informal empire, the amount of money they've been pumping into these small, poor countries in and around Africa to get more votes in the UN. Benedict, we could talk to you for hours, but I'm afraid we have run to time. Thanks so much for joining us here on Good Afternoon Britain. Well, let's get the expertise now of former NATO commander, Rear Admiral Chris Parry. Chris, why on earth has the government decided to do this?
Yeah, I'm asking myself the same question. I'm afraid to say we've got an ideologically based policy in play here. It's totally astrategic, contrary to national interests, and I don't think people have thought through the consequences.
Why do you think it is that this new government, or perhaps the Foreign Office, which has negotiated this deal, are putting the interests, or the opinion even, of the international community, which includes many states that we would consider our enemies, over and above Britain's strategic interests?
Because there are quite a few people in the Labour Party who are obsessed with the decolonisation agenda, and they think this is symbolic of that. What they're missing is that the Diego Garcia, which is one of the largest parts of the Chagos chain, is home to a major air and naval base that is critical not only to our strategic security, but also to that of the Americans as well.
Well, it's just extraordinary looking at the strategic importance of this location, slap bang in the middle of the Indian Ocean, really key for trade, really key for any particular growing influence that China might be trying to exert in that area. And Chris, this is my concern. Do you really think that it's Mauritius, a very poor country whose entire GDP of the country of Mauritius, is worth less than a fifth of what we spend every year on the NHS? I mean, this is not a big player in terms, but someone that is a big player and is that an ally of Mauritius is, of course, China. Do you detect the hand of China behind these calls, behind this international move?
Well, it's very complicated. I mean, Mauritius doesn't have any entitlement to the islands anyway. They've constructed it over the last 30 years or so. As you say, Mauritius is a relatively poor country, but there's a lot of what I call offshore interests, which are both licit and illicit. And we have got a lot of concerns about Mauritius in relationship to China. Now, to be fair, Diego Garcia, the base, is going to continue with access to it. But the fact of life is, all the Chinese have to do is rock up and put forces in the other islands, and they can actually neutralize Diego Garcia. And frankly, we have no assurances in place that the Mauritians are going to behave themselves. It's a critical base. And I'm afraid, just like anything else here, it's driven by ideology, not by strategy.
Chris, you say it's a critical base. What particular military capabilities does that outpost have? And what would NATO lose if it could no longer operate or was compromised?
Yeah, it's not so much NATO, it's to do with the free world, to tell you the truth. So to give you an example, it's got a huge runway that will take B-52 bombers. During the First and Second Gulf Wars, it was absolutely critical for transiting large aircraft into the Gulf War. It's a major pre-positioning base. The lagoon itself can hold up to 3 divisions worth of equipment and has done in the past in pre-positioned ships. And my concern is that the Americans and ourselves think that we've got exclusive access to the base. Well, if you give sovereignty away, they can foreclose that at any time they like. And if China leans on Mauritius at any stage, or indeed starts to base any of its forces in the remaining Chagos Islands, then the base itself is worthless.
Really concerning stuff, and deeply concerning too that this happens during parliamentary recess where we can't have government ministers questioned about it. Our political editor Christopher Hope was saying that there'll be a statement on Monday, but that's a post hoc statement after the fact. Really concerning stuff. Chris Parry, former NATO commander, Rear Admiral, of course, thank you so much for joining us here on Good Afternoon Britain. Really appreciate your time.
Now, joining us now in the studio is GB News political editor Christopher Hope. Chris, it's all kicking off now, isn't it?
It is really. I mean, it's going political too. We've got Tom Tugendhat just putting out a statement now to GB News saying this initiative, these talks were started during Liz Truss's premiership and they should never have started. Tom, who was the Foreign Secretary during Liz Truss's premiership?
Well, that was James Cleverly, who just happens to be a leadership rival contender to Tom Tugendhat. Is this a subtle dig?
Yes. Is it a yellow card, Miriam Case?
Well,
You're an MP. Is it blue on blue?
Well, there is some sort of rule about this in the 1922 committee. But, this is really interesting, isn't it? Because it does beg the question, how much control do government ministers like the Foreign Secretary have over what's going on in their department? Yeah. Cleverly, did he even know that this was happening? Did he direct it, or did the Foreign Office just see an opportunity?
Well, he's saying week on Twitter today he thinks in his world, this wasn't necessary. I think that's a debate which will go on over the weekend and into Monday, when we'll have a statement from David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, to MPs. He's been on the phone already to Lindsay Hoyle to explain why this happened today when Parliament wasn't sitting. It's a big deal, frankly, ceding sovereign territory to another country, and the fact there's been no common statement yet is a problem.
And such strategically important territory as well. Slap bang in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Yep.
This is where Trident submarines can refuel. This is in the middle of an important trade route and a sphere of the world where China has been trying to expand its influence. The China question here is really, really deep, because it seems that they might have been pulling some of the strings. It's something that Tom Tugendhat mentions in his statement. That's
right. Well, China, of course, are closely tied to Mauritius, and they are building their bases all over that area of the world. And indeed, flights took off to bomb Afghanistan from Diego Garcia. We are told the US don't mind this, but Joe Biden, the president, has issued a statement saying we're glad to get resolution. The resolution is a 100-year lease on Diego Garcia. We then, as the UK, have a right to extend it, and the Foreign Office briefed that it's not a situation like with Hong Kong, where we ceded back control to China of Hong Kong back in 1997, but really, or late 90s, but really a big worry here. And, China will be rubbing their hands at the UK withdrawing from the space.
Rear Admiral Chris Parry, a little bit earlier on the programme, who said, yes, this 99-year lease is on the base itself, but the rest of the archipelago goes to Mauritius. That's China allied. That could compromise the security of that base.
Of course, because if you have Chinese operatives very near to that base, they'll be looking at it all the time. It'll become less secure, and the US may not want to use it anymore. And that weakens maybe our relevancy on the world stage, and particularly to our biggest ally, America.
And what seems so extraordinary is that, unlike other overseas territory, formerly Hong Kong, Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands, nobody lives here in these islands. Nobody's saying, we want to be returned to Mauritius or anything like that. This is almost an unforced error by the British government, because nobody, apart from the international community, whatever that is telling us to do it. So is this a sign of things to come? We've already seen David Lammy, his views on Israel, more akin to the international courts than they are to what maybe British people think. Is this a sign of things to come?
Well, that's the worry. And we have lost several cases in the International Court of Justice. We had a UN vote unanimously against us. Since Brexit, I've got to say, we are more isolated on this. The EU had backed our continued claim to these islands until Brexit. Of course, we lost that allyship when we left the European Union. And that's a worry. Now, the Foreign Office do tell us in terms that the Falkland Islands and Gibraltar, of course, there are claims from Argentina and Spain on those two areas. They will stay British as long as the people there want to stay British, and you have these regular plebiscites, referendums in these places, and they do want to remain British. But the 20 or so Chagos Islanders, what do they think? I've asked the Foreign Office. I'll get back to you on that.